Recall back in the fall, the National School Board Association created significant controversy when it sent a letter to Joe Biden in part accusing parents protesting all sorts of issues from gender policy to masks to critical race theory of making threats and committing attacks equivalent to domestic terrorism, begging the president to send the alphabet agencies after them. But of course, that was just a letter. It doesn't necessarily mean much other than a crazy person wrote something, until 5 days later when Attorney General Merrick Garland responded with a press release and a memo that said, sure, we will gladly send the FBI over right away. In fact, we'll make a special FBI task force, including personnel from the National Security Division, to investigate and prosecute these so-called crimes of a few rowdy parents getting a little heated at the small-town high school library. And that quick response was a bit of a political and logistical mystery at the time. Why would the AG make such a politically moronic move so quickly? Apparently not having thought about this move for more than a few days' time. And how did he have the resources so immediately available? You're telling me the FBI is just going to reprioritize on a moment's notice? Don't they have more pressing needs for their attention, or perhaps terrorist plots of their own to organize more accurately? I guess they can mobilize on a dime for frivolous or politically motivated reasons. They do it all the time, point taken. But even still, what explains this lightning quick reaction? Was it simply misguided urgency from the AG, or was there something more to that? Good rule of thumb in general, but particularly for this administration, there is always something more to that. Turns out the speediness was because Merrick Garland and his staff effectively wrote that letter themselves, as did the White House, or at least they all had a very active hand in it. The whole thing was a ruse. It was all a big deception. They act like they just received a call for help, like the bat signal just went up and they're putting on the cape to be the hero, but it was actually them who put up their own bat signal. And that was reported a few weeks after the letter's publication, but it's now confirmed by a newly completed independent investigation into how that letter came to be. This part of the National School Board Association's response to the controversy that saw its former leadership ousted and many members leave the organization. The NSBA hired an external law firm to compile a report on the incident, and on Friday, that report was released, detailing exactly who created the letter and how. The most significant finding being that, as ridiculous as the final version of that letter that went to the White House was, it was actually toned down from prior drafts. Originally, the letter called for military mobilization against parents. The letter was primarily the work of former NSBA CEO Chip Slavin, who, a week prior to the letter going public, decided to remove language that asked Biden to deploy the Army National Guard and its military police to certain school districts where these supposed threats of violence were happening, but he decided to take it easy and just ask for the alphabet agencies instead. So as insane as it was, the letter we saw was the moderated version, actually. We got the version they thought would be more politically acceptable, but of course it still became a political disaster because this detached NSBA leadership had no understanding of its own membership or the public, or they just deliberately disregarded them. And speaking of political acceptability, we likely won't see much coverage of this ask for domestic military deployment, even though the consideration of the same idea in the context of a different president was a newsworthy scandal for the summer of 2020. Trump's consideration of deploying the National Guard to handle Summer of Love riots had the Washington Post asking if it's time to call him a fascist. And of course, his deployment of federal police to protect federal property in Portland was politically treated as an act of war.
You don't send in people acting like stormtroopers into the scene and evoking even more unease.
Now, of course, these two situations are very different. 2020's billion-dollar riot damage and 25-plus person body count was a much more significant and actualized threat than whatever the School Board Association was trying to frame as domestic terrorism. Their original letter included 24 examples of supposed parental threats. The majority of these were refusals to wear masks or otherwise disobedient but non-destructive protest. And in the handful of cases of actual demonstrated threats, it's still not clear what the federal role would even be in such instances. And that's a state's issue to police, and there's no indication that the states lacked the resources to do that. But to the point of those Trump critics, the deployment of National Guard or other military for domestic law enforcement is legally limited to specific narrow circumstances for good reason. It's just that consistency on those principles requires the same criticism for the School Board Association and, by association, in helping to draft this letter, as we'll get to, for this president too, because of course none of those legal qualifiers for domestic military law enforcement at all plausibly apply to a slightly spicy school board meeting. Under the Insurrection Act, the president can call up active military or federalize the National Guard for domestic law enforcement under 3 circumstances: at the request of a state, which has not happened here; to enforce federal law, but the examples provided by the School Board Association didn't show a violation of it; or to protect civil rights if local law enforcement is insufficient. Again, no example provided where local law enforcement was overwhelmed by a mob of parents in suicide vests. But of course, the principles or legal limitations of military law enforcement weren't applied here. Politics were. The School Board Association CEO didn't drop the military deployment language because it was legally inapplicable. He dropped it because he was worried about the optics. According to the investigation report, the School Board Association CEO removed the National Guard language because he was concerned it could be seen as asking for too much federal intervention. Not it is too much federal intervention, just could be seen as, because after all, if he actually had any principled opposition to federal intrusion on state and local matters, he wouldn't write this letter at all. And it's clear he doesn't understand the consequences of federal intrusion either. In an email immediately preceding the letter's drafting, the School Board Association CEO said that threats to school boards remind him of similar extremist language in the 90s after Waco and Ruby Ridge. So this letter was crafted under the preposterous reasoning that we need federal intervention to prevent such things, even though federal intervention is all Waco and Ruby Ridge were. No feds, no wife snipe. No feds, no charred children. This guy looked at Waco and thought the lesson is send feds to protect your kids. That's an impressive level of derangement. But it's not just the idea to send in the troops that the investigation found as a factor, making this letter even worse in its conception than what we saw in its final form. How the idea even came to be was a total betrayal of parents and member school boards. It was politically motivated hysteria from the top down. The former School Board Association CEO said he saw a Politico article about how the Proud Boys had showed up at 2 school board meetings, and he was so terrified that he directed his assistant to research and compile a list of egregious examples of misbehavior at school board meetings like this, which became the list of 24 almost entirely innocuous incidents characterized as terrorism in the final letter. In other words, the National School Board Association was not acting on behalf of its members. It didn't hear from local school boards that they're facing widespread threats and attacks and they're in need of help. The guy running the National Association just saw an article about his political opposition and decided to call up his friends at the White House and the DOJ to weaponize them. And that's the other major scandal about this letter. We were supposed to believe it was written independently by the School Board Association, and the president and the Justice Department received it at the same time that we all did, at its public publication. No, in fact, a White House senior advisor worked with the School Board Association to draft the letter for weeks in advance. And that White House senior advisor was also working with the Justice Department on the letter for weeks in advance. Meaning, Merrick Garland's announcement that he's sicking the FBI on parents was not just some hasty political miscalculation. It was a result of planning, and a deceptive one at that. The White House and the DOJ acted like they were just learning this information. They were not. They planned their own justification for federal crackdown for weeks and then laundered it through another organization to give the illusion of independence. And we know that this effort was top down and not bottom up, not just because of the White House and DOJ's collaboration, not just because of the investigation's finding that very few within the School Board Association itself even knew about the letter in its drafting phase, let alone worked on it, but because of its consequences too. The investigation found that reaction to the letter from the NSBA's membership was generally negative. After the letter's publication, a third of the organization's board left, and so did member state school board associations, 11 right afterward, and since, that number has grown to 24. As of this week. And of course, the pushback from membership and parents and the general public is what changed the organization's leadership, commissioned this investigation, and prompted a return to proper first principles. I'm not sure the National School Board Association has learned all their lessons because their press release on this investigation report makes no mention of that finding that the association wanted to deploy the military against parents, but it does acknowledge the letter was a product of disguised collaboration between the organization and the White House. And the association's new leadership has committed to being politically nonpartisan, to advocate for local control of schools, and to be committed to active parent engagement. The association has also adopted a new resolution opposing federal intrusion and expansion of the U.S. Department of Education into what are properly and legally state and local affairs. Even if imperfect, better than before. Proper principles late are better than proper principles never, though of course, demonstration of those principles is a lot more important than simple explanation of them. But in any case, an improvement. And an improvement that is solely attributable to parental and local pushback. Even if this entire letter was motivated by legitimate politician fear, and I know this association CEO wasn't a politician per se, but given his close work with them, he effectively was. But that's what we're supposed to believe. It wasn't their thirst for control that motivated the letter. It was their fear of danger. Well, even if so, let's not act like that's a bad thing. When they fear us, there is liberty. When we fear them, there is tyranny. And given that ultimate power must reside in one, the people or the politicians, the fear of one for the other is a necessary effect. So even if lines are crossed, you'd rather err on the lines that are closer to power in the people than the lines that are closer to power in the politicians, since that is the proper arrangement of things. In simpler words, if the explanation for this entire scandal is things got heated and the politicians got scared, the proper response is not apology. The proper response is good. Now stay that way. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.